My name is Chanchal Gupta. I'm a member of the SRE team at Edmunds. I've been with the team since the very beginning. I'm one of the founding team members to introduce this discipline to the organization. As a result, I've seen quite a few changes. Now, the title of my talk is Declutter Your Performance Metrics to Supercharge Your Website. It was initially submitted as Supercharge Your Web Page. As we go through the presentation, you'll see it's applicable to the website as a whole. So what can you expect from the talk? I'm going to help you, hopefully help you, provide guidance so you can choose meaningful metrics and thresholds that are actionable and additional signals that can drive improvement. Now, nothing about this presentation is a hard rule. Ultimately, you got to do what you got to do. But this is based on our last 10 years or so of experience. And this approach has been resoundingly successful. The SRE team at Edmunds is a small team. Some of the areas we work with are web page, website, performance analysis, monitoring, alerting, incidents, and RCAs. We are not a team that fits into your typical mold of how it's defined in the Google SRE book. And part of that is we've evolved over time based on organizational needs. Why are we focused on web page, website performance? Because Edmunds is all about the customer. We greatly value how the customer experiences our website. Edmunds is, I would say, a medium-sized company. Our technology team is 100 deep. We have offshore teams. We have microservices architecture, have an APM system in place, and we've tried a few others over the years. And what else? We are on AWS, which has a host of metrics, as you know, like millions of metrics. Before I get into talk, real quick on the photo, it actually is an upside-down car. Just hanging in there is the Edmunds office entrance. The car is a 2016 Chevy Corvette. It was installed in 2016 to commemorate the company's 50th anniversary. And above it is another car, which you can't see in the right, like above it, which you can't see in the photo. It's a 50-year-old version of the same make model. So that's a 1966 Corvette, and it's a nice place. I want to start with the early days at Edmunds. It was a different picture at that time. We had different kinds of problems, challenges we run into. One thing I remember that stands out is the war rooms. So what is a war room? It's kind of like, and we had quite a few of them. So what is a war room? It's like you have a problem, an incident, and a bunch of people from different teams get together, like in a room, to hash out, to resolve. That's kind of what a war room entails. And we had quite a few of them on a somewhat frequent basis. A new development would happen, at least a non-trivial development, of a major artifact, feature. It would be followed with a war room. And that used to be usually a late evening occurrence. Sometimes you'd start this exercise as first thing in the morning at 9 a.m., not something pleasant, I recall. You would like get a call, had to drop what we were working on. We would just sit there trying to unblock this. Why did we try to unblock this thing? Because business needs this. It's like the most important feature. And this was not because we were missing on an automated integration process for building artifacts and deploying them. You know, CI/CD. Typically, what happened in those kinds of meetings would be, you know, someone would say, so you're there to solve a problem. Someone would say, oh, this metric is up, this metric is down. And who are these folks in the war room? There are different teams representing different domains and subject matter expertise, like the best folks from the main teams across the org. We would spend time, sometimes collectively, or sometimes a few individuals looking at the problem, like, what is it? Following the tools, you know, APM and logs and all that to resolve it. Most of your tools are saying something. There's always some problem. To resolve it, it would take hours, sometimes the next day. You're chasing things, oftentimes in isolation. And sometimes it would just work. And you'd be like, I don't know what happened. If the resolution is found, it's all good. The incident's resolved, the problem's gone. Well, only temporarily, or at least that version of the problem. The next time a release happened, or maybe after next few releases, we'd be back there again. It would just come. It was like a thing. When CI/CD failed, we had to figure it out. We had to figure out if it is catching something real. People were like blurred out. There are different teams, services team, front-end team, operations team, product team. The best of the organization is there in the war room. And we are still in the same situation. There seems to be enough tooling. Is it the approach we are taking? Someone would say TTFP is high, third party is not doing good, onload is higher on client, client-side errors are high, the error rate is high in the cloud for this artifact, revenue is down, conversions are down. So that was a typical flavor of what those kinds of meetings would entail. You probably have run into a version of this. So what happened? The problem we were discussing, one of the core things underlying the war room story I mentioned was that there are just too many metrics. Different teams have a metric they've standardized on. From their point of view, that is the metric that held answer to a lot of the problems. And there are so many metrics, like hardware metrics, CPU, memory, we've all seen those. CPU graphs, your laptop has it. Memory is running low, CPU is running high. Kernel metrics, your operating systems metrics, which provide an abstraction over hardware metrics, like I/O, network latency, socket connection time, number of files opened, things like that. If you get further, then you have next level of abstraction, your application metrics, like availability. You could measure availability at the earlier levels of the abstraction, but we typically do it at application level. Availability, latency, blocking time, concurrency, the backend metrics. Then there's a flavor of that, the front-end metrics, like onload, render time, and things like that. On top of that, there are some metrics where there may be a disconnect between what they are measuring and what you think they are measuring. Take, for example, the onload metric from Navigation Timing API. A metric like this started to mean something different as technology grew. It still measures where the page loaded. It's just so there's a lot more going on, right? Like triggering ads multiple times, the async JavaScript calls. The page is never fully loaded because of the way it's been taken advantage of. Technology changed it. Imagine browsing a page with a fast onload time of 1 second, but a bunch of content relies on JavaScripts that are executing after onload. You might technically have experienced a fast onload time, but can't see the content or use the page until after like 10 seconds when all the JavaScript is done executing. Now compare it to a page that focuses on user-perceived performance, which prioritizes the critical component that the user is expecting and starts rendering in, say, 500 milliseconds. Yet it might have an onload time of 5 seconds. Between these two pages, the onload time performance and the actual user-perceived performance are telling two different stories. And I'd argue the onload isn't a good performance indicator to use in this case. Every technology layer, abstraction layer, can have a set of metrics that cater to its customers. Having too many metrics ends up meaning different things to different people. Which performance metric is going to measure what's important to your customer? Is it speed of loading the page, speed of transactions, etc.? If you think of a relatively straightforward metric like server-side time to first byte, TTFP, you might have a few different closely similar metrics to pick, depending on the setup, like measuring time with or without client network latency, or just the time taken to establish a socket connection, or time taken for the first byte or last byte to be sent. How do you reduce the metrics clutter so you are not looking too wide? So you can prioritize important work, cross-team work. How do you bring them together to become a single cohesive unit? Our war room would have been a million times better if we all knew what to look for. If there's some way to rally everyone around to what is important. Like if you can filter out the noise from important stuff. You don't have to go down these rabbit holes, not all of them. How do we do that? Find a metric that accurately represents what your customers wants. Think of it as your North Star metric. It is your success criteria, the key performance indicator. Imagine having a reference point, a metric that's your starting point for performance and customer issues. Let's say you maintain the release pipeline system. Maybe your key metric ought to be tracking the number of releases, and if it works for your customers. This is your metric to rally around. It's got to be organizationally important, actionable. By organization, I mean it's your org. It could be team, group of teams, your sphere. If not, you can run into situations where there is a disconnect between teams. If one team cares about a problem, another may not. In that case, it's non-actionable in some cases. The key is focusing on the customer, a metric that accurately represents your customer's wants. And who is the customer? If you're developing a REST API, endpoints, it could be another team. For website, it could be the website user. It's possible one team could be spending cycles optimizing a metric that doesn't help. Once you have the North Star metric and organizational buy-in, this would be a less frequent scenario. So at Edmunds, we help the customer research vehicles and shop for vehicles. Most of our customers come from organic search results. They search Google for some vehicle or related information and land on Edmunds. We are competing against every automotive research site out there. And we only have a moment if the customer asks. For content, we have to deliver it fast. That's it. If we don't, they have so many other choices. That's just the reality of the internet. There are n number of websites. If you search for a car, load Edmunds, and it takes more than a few seconds to start rendering content, you're probably going to hit the back button and go to a different search result. Users are impatient. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters to us is the customer. Because of who our customer is, our organizational focus is client-side performance. We want to offer the perfect experience, visual and interactive, to the website user. But we've opted to focus on the visual performance experience because of the nature of where our traffic comes from and the competition we have with other websites. We are not ignoring interactivity or other metrics. It's just that's where our main priority is. So there are many client-side metrics to choose. Over the years, we've iterated and gone through several of them. These metrics like total blocking time, first CPU idle, FCI, first contentful paint, FCP, et cetera. Few years ago, we selected largest contentful paint, LCP, as our quote-unquote organizational North Star metric. It's part of Web Vitals set of metrics, which also includes cumulative layout shift, CLS, first input delay, FID, FCP. For our business, the content, for our users to be able to see the content on our pages is critical. And that's what LCP is measuring. It became the one metric to rally around because it's a good measure of fast content experience, something that we were missing from the previous set of metrics. We are able to correlate and tie metrics with other business metrics like bounce rate and revenue and quantify the impact. And we identified LCP as the most impactful in our case. It's a good fit. We can actually measure customer improvements. It connected to various other metrics, going from front-end to back-end, steel threading our way from UX to application, web app, services, microservices, and infrastructure. All this led to a focused effort, organizational-wide. The level of organizational support we have is pretty impressive. People are actually dropping things to prioritize it. You don't have to negotiate that much or have cross-team debates. To summarize metric selection, find a metric that's a good fit for your customer's need. It may vary based on your unique setup. There has to be some North Star metric. What worked for us, it may not work for you. For example, if your focus is client-side performance, LCP worked for our website. If you are a different website, it may be different for you. If you are a CMS, your North Star metric might be users have a stable layout. Keeping tabs on cumulative layout shift, CLS, might be it. Like content doesn't shift around. Ads don't pop up randomly. Or other visual instability that might lead to user clicking on a wrong button on the page. In my example with Edmunds, it just happened to be an organizational issue. But for you, the audience, it might be organizational, team level, component level issue. There is something that's most important thing to your customer. That's your North Star metric. It's the thing that's going to get people to actually do something about it. It's not debatable. Everyone has their most important thing. Maybe they align, maybe they don't. Once you have this North Star metric, you are not chasing every problem out there. When we started out, we chose the metrics we cared about, but not everyone cared about them. Having a North Star metric brings alignment. It can help the team focus, is a good starting point. In the war room story I was discussing earlier, think of all the scenarios that could be avoided if you had a North Star metric. Operations is saying you need to fix error rate. If you're fixing something, it may be taking resources and time away from feature development. But if you can connect to your North Star metric, you can make the determination on urgency. Of course you will fix it, but it may not be the same urgency. You can spend all the time optimizing, but should you do it? Maybe that needs to be prioritized, and that's where having the North Star metric helps. And the North Star metric concept is not something that's limited to pure technology-related metrics. If your North Star metric happens to be a high-level entity like revenue, there is a way to do it. There are many systems that contribute to revenue. There is a way you can start to steel thread your way across what those drivers are. There is a quote-unquote North Star metric for any of these systems or the subsystems contributing to the metric. Okay, so you have a metric, and now you want to do something with that, make it actionable. You have your metric. What do? The next thing you do is you select a threshold, a value that you can use, or a set of values in some cases, which you can use to act on your metric. And acting on a metric typically involves like someone takes an action. So you can either prevent a metric breach or improve it. You can track. In general, you're keeping tabs on the metric by not necessarily checking on the metric all the time, but setting some form of monitoring using the threshold. Some of the common problems you will run into, and these are like age-old problems with thresholds. You either have them set too wide, so someone just set up a number. It's like it's a made-up number, like, oh, we should set it to X. It's nowhere near actual values are. It's too far from reality of the metric. In that case, the threshold is there unless you have a long-term or a really long-term plan or big effort going on. And in most cases, that's not the case. It's not a feasible threshold. Or some people, you set up a threshold which is very close to the thing you're monitoring. The gap is narrow between the actual metric values and where the threshold is. It's literally the value, the aggregate value. Your metric crosses that threshold several times a day. If you're setting up alerts, you end up having noisy alerts. Unless you don't want people to act on it, these alerts, especially if you have humans on the other end of these alerts, taking action, doing some investigation work, these alerts can just fall in these alerts can make them, these too many alerts or noisiness can make the threshold ineffective. I wonder how many of your alerts are going to that special folder in your inbox, never to be looked at, unless someone brings up the issue. Hopefully, those are not for critical components. Imagine if you have a misconfigured threshold and you were on call. Raise your hands if you've been engaged after hours for false alerts. Looks like a few people, or I know I have been. As I mentioned earlier, there are literally millions of metrics. And if you are keeping tabs on several of those, you got like a lot of thresholds and alerts to set up. Let's say you've set up the threshold right, and it breaches on a web page. You go to the web page owner and page owner and ask them to fix it, and they're like, nope, can't do it. I hope these other metrics like I have these other metrics like ad revenue, etc., for which the page is doing great. You say, look at this other metric that's breaching, and this other one is about to breach. They're like, whatever. In the early days of the war room story, there are tons of metrics that folks are looking at. Is there an actionable threshold for each metric, or are you simply comparing baselines on the fly by looking at trend lines over time, doing it at every occurrence of such a meeting? And let's say you've reduced the problem by focusing on your key metric, selecting your so-called North Star metric for the thing, or the system you're responsible for, interested in. Now you don't have to keep tabs on hundreds of metrics, at least not with the same level of urgency, but you have to set up a threshold. As an example, you're monitoring availability percentage of a bunch of REST endpoints, that typically have high availability, and you've set a threshold to say, where the team organization wants you to be, like 4 nines, that's 99.99%. Now your availability threshold is breached for an endpoint, and it's at, let's say 99.98%. Then you look at the data, you look at the numerator and denominator values that go into the calculation. The number of bad requests is like 2 out of 10,000 total requests. And this keeps happening like every few days. Is it a problem? Do you create an incident every time? The challenge is picking the right threshold and actually backing it up with meaningful data. The one thing the threshold has to be, it has to be accurate. The idea behind backing it up with meaningful data is to bring in accuracy. It represents the problem you are trying to solve with the metric better. It has to be actionable, and if no one's going to do anything about it, what's the point of it? It's like an alarm clock. You keep hitting snooze. It's just there for the novelty of it. The quote-unquote actionable part is like when you go to, so we already talked about it. You have the North Star metric. Now, if you pick a threshold that accurately represents what you want it to do, and that therefore makes it actionable, because, what else can you do? And by actionable, it means there are teams. Some teams which are like, oh, we'll do it. And some teams are like, oh, we won't do it. In those cases, when the team is not receptive to handling these things, you could work your way down till it is actually important. Like, what is that tolerance at which someone will do something? Start there. There are a few strategies on how to go about picking a threshold. I've listed out a few strategies here. There are perhaps many more, but these are the few that we've run into often. So current baseline, what is it? It's like we are here, or we were there later. So what is it? It's comparing your current metric data and using what you are as a baseline and coming up with a value, which will decide what you want. Depending on what you want, like not cross that line, depending on what you want, this is the most common, obvious method to come up with a value to recommend. Now, since you are trying to pick a single value out of several recorded values over time, you need a method to aggregate it, like an aggregation function. And one of the common aggregation method is to pick the nth percentile from a set of values. For example, you might say, we are going to take action at 75th percentile. Now you can tune that later, like reduce it, increase it, by n%, etc. Having a percentile gives you a single value from a multitude of values to look at, to compare. It has its pros and cons, but it for sure is an easy way, an intuitive way to make sense of data. And we talked about accurate thresholds, so this would be in the accurate column. If you do it right, you are coming up with a value using data. Another flavor is a trustworthy, authoritative source. it's just given to you. There's a trustworthy, authoritative source. This kind of metric usually, or I like to call it a benevolent dictator. Thinking of back in the day, Python and BDFL, Ruby language has it, Linux. There are many great examples. They developed the system, the language. Initially, they were hands-on, very hands-on, and shepherded it. Where it became popular, then hundreds, thousands of people are contributing to it. With time, they took a bit of a backseat, let other folks drive it, at the same time giving their sort of blessings, like this is a good idea or not, recommending every now and then. So there is a person out there that cares, and everyone trusts, and that's who sets it. It could be arbitrary, but you are trusting them. This person, entity, who's trustworthy, authoritative, gives you a value, a threshold value, which is a good one to rally around. I know some of you may say, what? Maybe thinking like, what is this? It's actually a sound option. I'll expand on this a bit later. This typically falls under like a guardrail type of a value, like an upper-lower limit, a do-no-worse type of value. You could say our time to first byte will not cross 500 milliseconds, or like the availability has to be at least 99.99%. It's like a hard line. These thresholds are usually away from the current, from where the current metric values at that time are. They are not very narrow type metric we talked about, where they're always triggering. That's when this kind of value given to you is usually effective. Then there is the metrics chain. Oftentimes, you are not building systems, services in isolation. If you're developing a microservice, it's calling another microservice, or it's used by a web page component code that maybe makes like 10 calls, to 10 calls to different microservices endpoints. You may have worked out a current baseline, but the metrics chain may decide if your baseline is good enough. It's part of the pie. All these microservices calls are adding to the pie of web page component time. If there's something that takes like 1 second to return, and there are 10 different calls primarily contributing to it, thinking of it as a pie, all these calls are like adding to the pie, and they kind of almost add up to the whole pie. And the performance is, if you're trying to improve the performance, the overall performance of this 1 second taking entity, like the web page, they all, you're only as good as the worst performer. So you may have come up with, you did some greenfield development, it comes out to be okay. This endpoint, you say, I have developed, does this cool thing, does this complex, figuring out, intelligent something, and it just takes like 400 milliseconds. And then that metric chain may put a pressing concern on it, like you have to further reduce it. So that kind of acts like a max limit there. This strategy does create a sort of peer pressure-like imperative to act on it. If the team doesn't want to take action, they are the oddball, and the data around it will change their mind. These three strategies I mentioned, they in a lot of, quite a few cases, you might be going through all of them. You start with a guardrail, like someone gave you a latency or availability or what have you. Let's say you are already meeting that. Then you use current baseline to figure out where you are, and maybe when you set up internal targets, like let's improve it further. And then the metric chain, depending on your system, might be the pressing concern that further determines if your baseline is good enough. Or should you improve it further by like 10%, 20%? It gives you another max limit. When you set up alerts, one of the questions that comes up is proactive or reactive alerts. And oftentimes, the alerts you set up are reactive, like, OK, alert me when I get like 1,000 errors. I mean, it really is an issue. There's already an impact. There is some impact undergoing, so that's kind of reactive. Proactive would be figuring out very minimal impact scenario, a threshold value that you determine to be sort of like a warning system. And error budget is one of those tools, concepts that kind of plays into this, and it helps with these things. What it does is it takes threshold value, the time window, which is a key component in all thresholds, something you'll have to figure it out, for your own metric and needs. The time duration that's appropriate, that'll have a big say in when the alerts fire. And then you add a cushion-like variable, the error budget percentage. And what you get here, it's actually a bit more intuitive to explain, at least to some customers. You can say your error budget is this much. As an example, if a service page, service or page receives a million requests in a month, a 99.9% availability goal gives you a budget of 1,000 errors over that period. If you set a warning notification when the error budget reaches 50%, so that's 500 errors, you would have a 50% cushion to remedy the problem before the system reaches the 99% availability goal. Another scenario we talked about was the 99.98% availability example, where you had 2 requests out of 10,000 failing, and you're 0.01% below your target, and you're creating incidents. So one of the ways to mitigate, you're creating incidents often. So one of the ways to mitigate that kind of a problem is to leverage error budgets. Maybe you can create an error budget that keeps adding to the pile. It's like a cumulative rolling bucket of values. It simplifies it for you. I mentioned some naming I did for the strategies. I'm going to talk about some actual examples of using those strategies at Edmunds. I'll start with the trustworthy, authoritative approach. The do no worse. A while back, like several years back, however we got to this situation, we didn't have set thresholds for TTFB. We had APMs and other systems. At organizational level, we didn't have any thresholds for TTFB. Our CTO at that time, in one of the meetings, there was some issue related to latency, and we'd had one every now and then, or some discussion of it. And in one of the meetings, he just came up with arbitrary numbers to say this is what our TTFB thresholds are for web pages. They became our guardrails. And one thing is, in the moment, you were like, this guy just came up with some random numbers. But the reality is those numbers actually worked for us for a long time. We've had them, tracked them. It's helped us prevent deterioration. Part of it is we've always kept them, tracked them, and made sure they are not breached. Action is taken. So that's one example. Another one, so I mentioned our North Star metric is LCP. So Google did the heavy lifting here. Hard work of calculating what is a good threshold for users to have for LCP. We chose to use what Google recommended as our default, just to get the ball moving. And we got lucky. Didn't have to figure one out in this case, especially when we were starting out with LCP, which at the time was a novel metric. But as we got more data, we found that we were actually outperforming that. Our pivot was to use that threshold for success rather as a max limit, the guardrail threshold now. See, I mentioned earlier, this can be a sound strategy. At that moment in our journey, it did help us address some of our most egregious performance issues that we initially weren't aware of. So for LCP, now we are outperforming our previous threshold, or guardrail threshold. We had to figure out a new baseline, reevaluate it. We sort of changed it. Baselining is like the most common method. And I imagine most folks are already familiar with it. I remember from a while back, when building a new REST endpoint that did some complex processing, like more than a simple database get, adding some stats-D instrumentation to get timing metrics to form a baseline, which also helped during development iteration to see performance impact. And once the endpoint was productionalized, there is a production baseline to keep tabs. OK. So you have a North Star metric that tracks the important stuff that matters to your customers. Now you want to have a good threshold. If you have a good threshold that accurately tracks what you want to get out of the metric, what the metric is for is going to help you. If you had a solid, like a good threshold, and you have a North Star metric, which represents your customer's needs, you could set up alerts and catch problems when they are small problems, when they have very little impact. Thinking of the war room I talked about, where it would come again and again, every time there were a few different systems involved, like a website, a web app, the main web app that's serving web page, or like a release system, CI/CD failed. If you had a North Star metric and a threshold that accurately represents key issues, you could set up alerts and catch those issues before they become big. You don't need to be there all the time or find it out late when it is impacting a lot of your customers and all hell is breaking loose. It's good to be on the good side. And what does it take to have a good threshold? It has to be accurate. If anything, it has to accurately track issues. You don't want it to be too far out or too sensitive. It has to be actionable, and that goes hand in hand, with it being a North Star metric and being accurate. Or test it. Maybe the team is not receptive to handling these things. Work your way down till it is actually important. Like, what is that tolerance at which someone will do something? Start there. How do you pick a threshold? Some of the strategies we've discussed, so I'm going to kind of summarize them. Someone like a trustworthy source, authoritative source just says that's the answer, that's the target, that you will take action at this level. The do no worse. Use current baseline, and using an aggregation function like percentile, figure out a value. That gives you a more accurate representation with respect to how the value is actually trending. And you will force fit yourself in between something, like a metrics chain, a hierarchy of metrics. Then measure the correlation with that threshold and the North Star metric. Is it actually impacting the customer? Then you may additionally tune it. I'm going to have some water. So you have your key metric defined, your North Star metric. You got a good threshold, which is accurate, and the things that you want to be alerted on. We already talked about a North Star metric, and it gets you to the main problem, the key problem in a system, a service, or what have you. So there is a problem now. What do you do next? If you look at the traditional, the obvious step is, the approach would be, you go into your systems that are monitoring, kind of going back to the war room story I mentioned earlier. Okay, now your threshold alerted you, you're at the right spot. Maybe the release failed. Now you know the problem, some North Star metric was having problems. What do you do next? You start looking at the tooling. Are you going through the same set of processes as before? What is your CPU? Someone says the CPU is high. There is this, the latency was high. That's why it failed. You're trying to connect what could possibly be causing the failure of your key metric. Your additional signals, and there are a lot of them, and again, it happens again. You're going through your additional signals, and it's like again and again. The release system failed. The same key metric breached. So yeah, this keeps happening again, right? So every time you're essentially looking at plethora of metrics and trying to figure out various correlations, connections, like a pin board, putting pins on a board. This happened because of this. This happened because of this. Is there a better way? Can we streamline it? What happens if you take the North Star metric, the key North Star metric for a system component, and you do that at scale? You essentially find the North Star metric for the next key contributor. You know the next key contributor to your main top level North Star metric. So it's like a chain. If you were to think of it as a chain of metrics, which actually it is, in many cases it is obvious, and in many cases it's not. And you essentially are doing this at scale. You're finding the key metrics. For example, we talked about TTFB, right? So one of the examples is, let's say you have a web app and you have TTFB, your web page TTFB, and that's your main metric, your quote-unquote North Star metric. Now the call is composed of 10 different endpoints and calls, and some of them are in parallel, some of them are in sequence, but these calls are bulk of the time contributing to your main metric, TTFB. You want to identify the main contributor, the main piece in that call. As an example, maybe one of the calls, endpoints takes typically 60% of the time out of those 10 calls. That guy is something you should probably keep an eye on going forward, something you want to track. In this example, that could be your subpart. In this example, that's the main metric you want to track, and that's essentially building a chain, paying attention to the subparts. And once we have that kind of a setup, it kind of brings alignment. We talked about how the North Star metric is your go-to metric. You know it's breaching, you have a problem. Now, once you do this, you know where to go next. It's like a magnet. Metrics are getting aligned. The North Star metric is pulling this other metric. And when metrics get aligned, all the war rooms and things get much easier, because you don't have to go there blank. You don't have to spend time and do repetitive, start from scratch kind of analysis, or spend hours looking at 15 different metrics before you find, and in most cases, this may turn out to be like a lot of the times, you may find the problem right away, going through this chain. The further you go, the better it is. At least start with the very first subpart. That's the starting point. Once you have the top guy, the top metric down, it's easy to start organizing the ones at the bottom. And I mentioned earlier how you want to have a North Star metric for your system, subsystems, components, key parts. If you have one for each one of them, you're kind of building this chain, you're organizing your metrics, you have a focused set of metrics to look at. And that is how you supercharge your website. And what does supercharging look like? If you're really supercharging something, it's like life-changing. Our war room, we don't have war rooms. I can't remember the last time we had a war room. That war room story I mentioned, gone. You know what's even better than not having a war room? Like finding an incident and not having to work on it immediately. That's what we are working on with things like early detection. Talked about error budget earlier. It's like finding these problems where you can nip them in the bud fast. So at Edmunds, once we had built these, so LCP being the North Star metric, as we were trying to improve LCP value, over time, teams had made progress in improving LCP, primarily focusing on their pages and improving it. Originally, we were thinking of these metrics like, there's LCP, FCP, TTFB. So TTFB was already there, It was below our guardrail threshold, the max limit I mentioned earlier. So there was no imperative to improve it. Now LCP, or key organizational metric, is not improving as much as we'd like. What do? We look at the chain of metrics leading to LCP. There's FCP, then there's TTFB. We connected TTFB improvement to LCP improvement, or North Star metric. There is the quote-unquote website supercharger. We got a vital metric via a customer-focused metric. We got to a vital metric. The platform team undertook an effort to do that, to improve TTFB. Now performance is improving across the board. From an SRE point of view, this is what we wanted to do, forever. Ultimately improve performance. We have data that incidents are dropping over time, and the ones we have are typically less severe, don't have a large impact. Performance is improving over time. that's supercharging your website, I'd say. The main objective of improving performance, we've sort of steel-threaded our way to it via LCP, our North Star business customer focus metric, our most important metric. The level of organizational support we have is pretty impressive. We have organizational support at almost all levels. I haven't seen it before. We don't have cross-team debates. You don't have to negotiate that much. Previously, it was like amnesia. We'd start over again. You bring up an issue, someone's like, it's not important to us. Well, let me check the priority. You go to the product guy, and they'll be like, let me put it in the backlog. Now, it's a problem or not? It's a priority or not? If it is a problem, fix it as quickly as possible, because folks know it can contribute to a problem tomorrow. We don't have these debates. We definitely don't have these debates cross-team. To be honest, we don't have most of our systems there. It's a work in progress, but some of our key systems are already following this pattern, this approach. You want to get to harmony. Incidents are not a problem, for the most part. No helter-skelter. Then you can start doing things like error budgets, nipping these problems even before these are problems. But you can't do that unless you are 100% confident in what you are measuring. To simplify this, I would say start top-down. First, identify your core metric for the main system that measures customers' wants accurately, your North Star metric. Then work your way down to the main contributors by focusing on chain of metrics, the core metrics for the key components that contribute to your main metric. All these subsystem component metrics are driving towards your main metric. You might already have a North Star metric. In some cases, it may be one of the more common, obvious metric. Like for a REST web service, it might very well be TTFB. Following this approach brings a sort of self-organizing alignment between metrics, which makes things simpler. Now, if your North Star metric is having problems, you have a key go-to metric to look at. Remember earlier I mentioned that you could find a North Star metric for each system? Once you have that for subsystems and component, this will supercharge your website. Okay, so to summarize this, takeaways, no matter how abstract your company's mission is, you can get to it. Every abstract problem that contributes to it, every system, every abstract problem has a system that contributes to it. Every system has a number of components or other systems. Thinking of a rowing boat race, you want to be in the boat where everyone is rowing in the same direction. Even better, in sync. How many, it's sort of daunting when you think about it. It's like, I need to align everyone in the organization to do one thing. How many millions of metrics there are? How many different concerns people have? And probably they are competing. Once you take this approach, it makes things a lot easier. All right. So yeah, that's it. Questions? Yep.
Thank you for that talk. I was wondering, what does Edmunds use for their tools to help them with their metrics, like their API monitoring or any tools? What do they use and recommend?
So we have an APM. I'm wondering, is it appropriate to name? Yeah. So we do have. So we have the usual system. We have an APM. Can I say the name of the APM? I think it's okay, right? So we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have. We've iterated through few, so we have New Relic right now. But for this specific, we built we actually worked with our team, and because we were early to this whole, in our case, remember I mentioned LCP, so Web Vitals is, it's kind of a new set of metrics. It's only, I think, a couple of years old, three years maybe max. So we built our own, we have an excellent data pipeline, so we built our own sort of data ingestion pipeline, and we built, so our web pages have their own performance recording, which goes to our data warehouse, so we leverage that. On top of that, for our specific example, our North Star metric, we also use we built another pipeline our team built was for, because it's the gold standard for that is Google PSI. So we have some kind of a system which, kind of pulls data from them and tracks it over time for all the key pages. So we have those kind of systems, and there is APM always, if you want to dive deep. Does that answer your question, or are you looking for something? Okay. Our company has we've gone through, by the way, APMs are excellent tools, so we've had a lot of the big guys in the last few years. They're really, useful also.
Any other questions? It's a very dense.
Okay.
Killed them. Okay. Let's just say thanks to Chanchal.
Thank you. Thank you.
And one thing is, questions. Questions are like super interesting to people because saves them from. They can't ask the questions.
Sorry.
So ready to do it again, Chanchal?
Oh yeah. I think we have
5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Okay, we have time. Yeah, I think the other presentation. So that's a good. So your question is from an organizational point of view, how did we get the buy-in, so to speak, right? Or
yeah, the process that you observed, or what you would recommend for other people and other companies that are struggling with. They're at different stages, right? So one company might be establishing their North Star within each of their team,
sure.
and but then once they've done that, then just how the leadership comes together and establishes
right.
the way forward.
So yeah, I think you got the, so, I'm glad you got that, takeaway, sort of like the North Star metric, sort of like, like the key is like, it's the customer. Like for us, for Edmunds, website customer, we value a lot. And I mean it, like, it's like product worries, even technology, is like all about the end user. Are they getting a good? So in our case, it took years. I mentioned like it was a long journey. And like, maybe 2-3 years ago, we settled on this, and it's been, pretty good after that. So once you have that, I think like truly, like, your business's like core thing, right? The North Star metric, like, in our case, the website customer, and we could track like customer improvements with this metric. We actually did, I know I ran out of time. Initially I did say I was gonna get into bounce rate and revenue. A team even connected it to revenue through the metrics pipeline and stuff. It's a loose correlation, but it's good enough, it's directional. So yeah, I would say, that is the key part. And a little bit of, there is the little bit of your organizational has to be supportive. Like we have support across the levels. So, in our case, there is a little, I don't want to say, luck factor, but there is a little bit of that. Like, otherwise it'll take longer. But if you are speaking the language of like the customer, as a, if you're SRE performance, right, you're saying, this is what matters to your customer. For example, when we started, we would come up with like this, I mentioned like total blocking time, FCI, from a client-side focus. We iterated over a lot of them. We weren't getting this like buy-in, so to speak. But when we just landed on this and we, convinced, and the teams were like product teams. So yeah, the other thing is, depending on your setup, who are the other teams, like product teams, you want to, have a few of them convinced, if I had to come up with a process like, and then I think it takes time, but, it should, and there is a little bit of, your organizational has to be supportive, like, that's there too.
And when a company has more than one customer, so for example, they might have the paying sponsor, for example, and then they have the end user of the application.
So that's a good question. I think your question is, can you have more than one sort of like a North Star metric, like along that line?
Well, yeah, I guess it just, it gets somewhat, maybe not tricky is the right word, but you're negotiating, because if you have two different customers.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you can have two. So, and I think this is when we were, we were discussing, it's like, so you can have one for your, let's say, and in our company also, like I said, we haven't done it across the board, but there are systems where there are two different types of users. One is the website user. Like we have another component, like, where there are dealers, car dealers. So that could be another, like a North Star metric for them. But again, you have to identify, like, like a key. You can't just have like 10. Like, you can say, oh, I have these 5, 10. Maybe you can, but then that loses the focus. It's like the less you have, the better. But you can totally have like two different representing, different set of customers. Like one for one or two, one for another, maybe one more or two more. So yeah, that's totally okay.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right, I think my battery's running low too here. I got a red one. Thank you.